All right. So, hi everybody. There, you gave me a really nice intro, and it is true. I have a TikTok that you can find. I have literally a single TikTok that took off, and so I feel like I have to maintain my perfect record and never post a TikTok again. So I'm really excited to be here today, and I'm here to talk to you about what is basically my favorite question to ask, which is, what is the problem we're solving for here? Since they've already introduced me, I'm not going to talk too much about myself, but I do work at a fully distributed agency called 10up, and I'm really fortunate to get paid to work on open source, including as one of the lead developers for WordPress. WordPress recently turned 18, and beyond being a significant piece of software with a lot of history and the things that happen with like a policy of backwards compatibility, it's at the center of a very large and sprawling ecosystem that spans both open source and commercial interests. I've been contributing to WordPress for 10 years and have been a lead developer for a little over 6. So I think it's safe to say I've spent a good bit of time thinking and talking about what it means to maintain open source software. So the day after I agreed to give this talk, I saw this tweet. It's like a sign. It says, apropos of nothing, every time I've put a strongly held solution to a weakly defined problem into production, it's blown up in my face like a Wile E. Coyote cartoon. You might have heard the strong opinions weakly held saying at some point. It kind of regularly comes up in open source and maybe broader engineering discussions, but I find this to be an even more applicable twist for open source development. This talk is not about root causes, though, I promise. We don't have to dig all the way into like your past's past to figure out what's causing the problems. We're just here today to talk about making sure we have a clear view of the problems that we want to solve for. So I tweeted this yesterday. I have a hot take. I think it's backward that GitHub lets you turn off issues but not pull requests. Don't hate me. Thank you, GitHub, for putting on this event. To me, a pull request represents an approach to a solution, which should always be preceded by or at least accompanied by a problem definition, which I believe should live in an issue. That is to say, a project can always have problem definitions, which may or may not have proposed solutions yet, or a project may even be in a place where it's open source, but not open process for whatever reason. That isn't to say you can't also define a problem within a pull request, but there are many reasons a PR ends up not being merged. A few talks so far today have touched on this, and then you lose any problems. You don't lose the problems, but they lose visibility when you end up closing those pull requests. WordPress, the core software project, is actually somewhat infamous for still being on track. And while some of our sub-projects do run entirely on GitHub, it's true. We use Track for ticket, aka issue management. We do support pull requests as a part of the code contribution workflow now, but all PRs must be attached to a Track ticket. The breakdown is roughly that PRs hold discussion that is specific to that proposed implementation, such as code review and CI results, while the Track ticket contains discussion about the problem at hand and how best to resolve it. On other projects that I personally set the standards for that run on GitHub, I require that any PRs be accompanied by an issue. Now, I say that, but I am human and also a classic lazy developer. So there are times where I might let the issue slide because it's something like a typo, but the principle stands, right? Every solution is in service of a problem. I wish that GitHub would let me formalize a type of requirement, like requiring all PRs to be attached to an issue. In WordPress, with that whole Track thing, to associate PRs to Track tickets, we do a bunch of, all right. So wait a second. I need to back up and talk about my problems before I get into solutioneering. So here are some of the problems that I see that perhaps resonate with you. Okay, so pull requests are going into loops of endless feedback over implementation details, and the underlying problems never get fully addressed. Or maybe contributors are understandably attached to these solutions that they've poured their precious time and energy into, but when it's not clear what the solution is targeting, the goal can get lost, which frequently leads to poor solutions for the actual problem at hand that then have to be discarded or rewritten, which leads to a very negative contributor experience. Or sometimes, maybe even more often, those poor solutions do make their way in because we are reviewing code diffs without enough context, and the diff itself is fine. And we end up with our favorite thing, technical debt. So here's a practical example of something you might have experienced. This is sort of it's not a fully made up story. It's sort of based on something that I went through recently. So a hopeful contributor opens a PR with like a 40, 50 line diff saying, I made the form fields turn red when there's invalid input. The CSS looks fine, selectors look reasonable, there's this compact new JavaScript file, they've even included a screenshot, and you think, yeah, sure, form validation, great. You merge it, it goes into beta, and then the reports start flowing in because you're lucky you've got beta testers. It isn't broken, but it looks bad in some other contexts besides the one that got screenshotted. It's fighting with some other JavaScript that's doing form handling from like 10 years ago that you've forgotten about. And worst of all, people are finding the forms even more confusing. So what gives? This is one of those common problems, right? And I think it's been touched on earlier. Reviewing diffs in a PR doesn't paint you the full picture of its place within the broader project and how it interacts with other parts. In small projects with small maintainer groups, you might be able to count on institutional knowledge to catch these things before a merge. But even then, like, things happen, right? So you might be thinking we could implement visual regression tests or integration tests or, all of the above. And yeah, that might be the case. But those are still solutions in search of a problem. So let's get back to figuring out what problem our hopeful contributor might be trying to address. After talking with the contributor and taking a look at the reports that have come in since you merged it, you realize that none of your forms are actually explaining which fields are required and what type of data they're expecting. So the change to make the fields red is really just highlighting that bad surprise for your users. And it turns out that just a color change isn't a strong enough visual cue anyway. So in this case, it turns out that you have many different solutions that can be put into place to move you toward the same goal, which is making forms easier, more consistent to fill out, more predictable. And you need maybe sort of like an umbrella issue to track all the efforts involved. Maybe it's an umbrella issue with checkboxes, or maybe it's, you open related issues, depending on your project, right? But you might need to open something that allows you to discuss different approaches and the details for things like better copy, visual design, that visual regression testing, revisiting that old JavaScript file that was doing stuff that everybody had forgotten about. Maybe it's like still a jQuery, WordPress. So those are the things that might happen, right? Is that as engineers, we see this thing and we see this thing happen and it causes another problem. And in our heads, we jump immediately to, how do I solve this problem, right? Like, how do I come up with more solutions? But we haven't yet actually backed up before the problems were caused. Again, promise it's not about root causes, but getting to the point where we are able to say, hey, let's take a step back. Let's think about what is this thing that I'm trying to solve for? What is the actual problem at hand? So going back to my hot take, this really applies to any technical project management tooling. We just pick on GitHub more because it's so commonly used, kind of like WordPress. So not only do I have my strong opinion about PRs and issues and the differences between them, but I also think that there's still a lot of value in a patch-based workflow, which is what we use on Track. You aren't required to use a PR, you can still submit patches. So in particular, with the patch-based workflow, what that means is you've taken that diff and you save it as a file and you upload that file to the issue tracker. So the thing that I find to still have a lot of value in that kind of workflow, there are many things, but in particular, the ability for anybody to set it down or pick it up, right? You can open PRs that build off of somebody else's. The challenges of that probably being material for an entire talk. But it really just highlights what I'm saying. They all need to be tied back to a central problem definition so that the relationships between those PRs are clear, both for current maintenance and also for future code archaeology. Maybe some of the solutions that we could go after lie with the tools themselves, like the ability to turn off PRs than not issues, or maybe you would use discussions more, right, as like a GitHub tool. Or maybe they're on like a custom integration side, like maybe you want to use a bot or GitHub Actions, Brian's favorite thing, to prompt people to open an issue to go with their PR. Or maybe they're on the human side, right, where you could involve a broader contributor base by making a company issue creation a triage task. There are a lot of different paths you can take depending on your own needs, which is your problems that need solutions. So what can projects do besides ideate eternally, like I was just doing? Very guilty of that. Some things, these have already been touched on in other talks today, but things like clearly defining your process, your contributor guidelines, doing some road mapping with clear prioritization. I also really liked what Rose said earlier about still being able to find the good ideas and perspectives, even when you're declining a change proposal or a PR, as well as her advice on how to respond as maintainers, right? So rather than thinking like, I'm throwing this thing away, oh, this is a solution in search of a problem, helping them figure out like, what is the problem that I'm facing? Lots of people are very bad at problem definition because it's something that they haven't thought about having to do, right? Like as a specific skill. I feel like, especially as developers, like people who write code, we have this tendency to get in a mindset of everything has a solution, right? And all of our effort, all of our prioritization is toward coming up with solutions rather than seeing problem definition as like a discrete skill. One thing that we could think about doing, as I previously mentioned, is having people like your triage team, in WordPress we call them bug gardeners, help with creating issues from pull requests, right? So somebody might submit a pull request and you don't want to burden them further by asking them to open an accompanying issue. So maybe that's something on your triage team to sort of absorb that maintenance burden upward. Another thing that you could perhaps do as a part of that is something we do in WordPress because we don't rely on like commit history to generate our software credits. And that would be giving liberal credit for people who clearly define their problems or define how to reproduce them, right? Or people who help others clearly define their problems and reproduction steps. So those are things that people have also put time into, right? Much like there's discussion about like making sure you give proper credit to designers, copywriters, all of that. Anybody who helps push the project forward, anybody who's giving their time, giving their energy into helping you understand what your problems are, is somebody who deserves credit for making your software project better. And above all, remember that sharing what we build on open source terms is cool. I love it. Open source, copyleft. But if we're actively being maintainers and stewards to our communities, then we'll do a much better job when we remember what we're trying to solve for. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I hope I've managed to hit on something you can identify with as an open source software maintainer or as a contributor. You can find me on Twitter, for which I apologize in advance, at Helen Sandí, my full name. I'm going to head over to that little billboard in Gathertown, right where you came in, and I will try to hang out there to chat from now until at least the next break, kind of like you might be able to find me during a conference. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was fantastic. We'll put the link up for folks who want to go chat with Helen over in Gathertown. So that's github.co/Gathertown. Oop, there we go.
Awesome.